Hello?
Blog Talk Radio.
You are now listening to True Murder, the most shocking killers in true crime history, and the authors that have written about them. Gacy, Bundy, Dahmer, The Night Stalker, BTK. Every week, another fascinating author talking about the most shocking and infamous killers in true crime history. True Murder, with your host, journalist and author, Dan Zupansky.
Good evening. This episode of True Murder is brought to you by Audible, the world's leading name in digital audiobooks. On November 30th, 1989, in a lonely place off Florida's Interstate 95, 51-year-old Richard Mallory shuddered under the impact of 4 .22 caliber slugs being pumped into him by a naked, hard-faced, blonde hooker. While he suffered a slow, agonizing death, she stripped him of his valuables and drove his Cadillac back to the motel where her lesbian lover was waiting. In 1990, her killing spree kicked into high gear, with 3 men slain in as many weeks. Of the 6 of her 7 male victims whose bodies were found, some were nude. All had been shot dead and robbed. In January 1991, pawnshop records led to the arrest of Aileen Carol Wuornos, 35, a.k.a. Lee, an abusive alcoholic man-hater with a murderous hairtrigger temper. Wuornos began prostituting herself at age 12 for cigarettes and beer. At 15, she bore an illegitimate child. At 16, she took to the highways as a hitchhiking hooker. In 1986, with a lengthy rap sheet and prison term under her belt, she entered into a relationship with Tyria Moore, 24. Tired of turning $20 tricks, Wuornos decided to rob her customers of everything they had, including their lives. Her arrest and trial prompted a worldwide media frenzy. Ultimately, Wuornos received 6 separate death sentences. Here is the definitive account of a killer who confounded the profiling experts, forever changing their concepts of the crimes of which a woman is capable. The book that we're featuring this evening is Lethal Intent, with my special guest, journalist and author, Sue Russell. Welcome back to the program, and thank you very much for agreeing to this interview. Sue Russell.
Hi, Dan. Nice to speak to you again. Thanks for having me on.
Yes, it's been a long time. It's been a long time. Thank you very much. And congratulations on the new updated version of your book, now available in ebook, published on demand, audiobook, and the new updated version. So congratulations on the release of that.
Yes, thanks. It was nice to have a chance to take another look at it and do a sort of update of the last decade, because the last edition that I wrote came out just before her execution, so that wasn't in Lethal Intent until now. And the sort of legal dramas leading up to it weren't in the book either. And, of course, nor was the sort of legacy since her execution. So it was nice to have the opportunity to do an update, that's for sure.
Yes, it was a ever-evolving story, right? And still to this day, the legacy lives on. So it's an incredible story that has a life of its own. And thanks for Lethal Intent. Now let's get right into this for our international audience that isn't so familiar with the Aileen Wuornos case and this story. Let's go back to and really paint a portrait of who Aileen Wuornos, because if anyone knows, based on the research that you've done over all these years and living with this story, certainly you know who Aileen Wuornos really was and where she really came from. So tell us, starting with her father, because it's very interesting, the genetic background of this person and where he ends up. And so anyways, let's talk about Leo Pittman, and let's go back to her birth father.
Absolutely, yes. Well, Leo Pittman is Eileen's birth father, but she never met him. his parents, Diane Wuornos and Leo Pittman, were separated before Eileen's birth, and in fact, Diane left Aileen and her brother Keith, 18 years age difference between them, with the grandparents twice during the first 2 years of Eileen's life, so there was that abandonment thing going on. But meanwhile, Leo had a bit of a criminal bent, shall we say, and
right.
he really came undone when, as he should have done, of course, when he abducted a 7-year-old girl from outside a school, took her in his car, took her across state lines, raped her, drove her back, and left her outside the school. Sort of strange bit of courtesy there, mixed in with a completely heinous crime. Very odd, but anyway, we're glad the little girl was taken back to the school, but she was, and when she had to testify against her attacker in court, when she saw him, she broke out in welts all over her skin. You know, it was just a very visceral reaction. So Leo Pittman was put away now, like Aileen, who, of course, they didn't know each other, but he also committed a capital crime, because kidnapping and rape across state lines was a capital crime, probably still is. And so, quite independently, these two people who never met committed capital offences. I think that's pretty interesting, don't you, Dan?
Yes, and the other similarity, and it is again a striking one and probably a telling one, is that Leo was also abandoned by his parents and raised by his grandparents as well.
Yes, he had a rough background, and then just to return to Leo Pittman, I mean, ultimately he posed as pretended to be mentally ill at one point and got in a mental hospital. Then I think was back in prison. I do have the FBI records somewhere, and and ultimately he killed himself in prison. So there came a point when even if Aileen had wanted to look him up, she couldn't have done, because he took his own life. So that was, a rocky start to any child's life, all that going on in the background, even though she may not have been aware of it. The waves in families, the emotional turmoil, the discord, and in the case of the grandparents that she was living with her brother Keith, a lot of abuse there too, in terms of the grandfather would take a leather belt to Aileen, and there was a lot of verbal abuse, and both grandparents had alcohol issues, so it was not a happy home, but it was an odd home, because the grandparents had two other children. Diane Wuornos had siblings, Laurie, who became wife and mother, and I met her when I was writing the book, and Barry, brother, who also got married, etc., and had kids. But the Laurie and Barry, well, Barry had kind of left home, but Laurie was still in the home when Aileen and Keith were brought into the home. So it was one of those odd family arrangements where they were known as, the grandparents would sort of called them their children, but they were really their grandparents, and Laurie called them her siblings, but she was really their aunt. If you can follow that, you're a better man than I am. Yeah, it's a bit convoluted, isn't it? Sorry, I hope you could keep up with that. Yeah, so it was a dysfunctional household, to say the least, and there's no question, Dan, that she was abused. For any child, I think, to be selling sex and charging for sex and charging a packet of cigarettes or 35 cents for a sexual act at age 11, we can assume that there was sexual abuse in there somewhere. It's hard to know who was the perpetrator with Aileen, because her stories changed on everything, just literally back and forth. So at the end of the day, I can't tell you definitively, who did abuse her, but there's no doubt in my mind that she was abused.
Now, the interesting thing is that you talk about, selling sex at a very, very young age, but we're not talking about any kind of big aspirations, like you say, for a packet of cigarettes. And what I thought was just sad was the nickname that she had for her was Cigarette Pig. So you could see that this was all about, a desperate attempt to get some kind of attention. So she certainly wasn't the most popular girl. In fact, she was the one who was left out of a lot of things. You tell a story about how at an early age she managed to arrange a party at the home, and then the people came over to the party, but then kicked her out and let her stay in the backyard. So it's just a bunch of sad stories like that.
A lot of sad stories like that. And yes, to think the other kids, who even those who were having sex with her called her Cigarette Pig, and they wouldn't admit to one another that they were having sex with her. So it was, yes, they wanted the sex, but they were ashamed to say they were having sex with her. And basically she was denigrated in every way. So very, very sad. And she was very isolated, and she had this explosive temper, which we've talked about before, Dan, which really hampered her ability to fit into life as other people do. She would just blow up out of nowhere, and others were afraid of her. They didn't want to be around her. They didn't want to be near her, and you never knew when she was going to fly off the handle about something. And one time there was a babysitting incident where she approached her sister Laurie, who was doing the babysitting, and held a kitchen knife to her throat. This kind of thing meant that, of course, people stayed away from her. They were afraid of what would happen if they got too involved with her. And, yes, she was scary, I think, to even her own sister/aunt.
Now, her family life was horrible, and living in the neighborhood wasn't much better in terms of getting any kind of respect. And I think, which is, of course, is obvious and very important to anyone, but especially Aileen Wuornos, attention and love, and which she wasn't getting from her home, had never met her father. So it was lacking in her family unit. What I thought was very interesting, too, as part of the characteristic was that how promiscuous she really was at a young age. Again, you did the research, and so there was an account of a neighborhood friend, actually witnessing her having sex with her brother. So she had sex. She was very promiscuous, and that will lead to, her decisions later in life. As she gets a little bit older, she kind of turns around this sort of, at least it's to a certain degree anyway, the idea that she is very promiscuous, very interested in sex, and is constantly negotiating at an early age and all the way through.
Don't you think she was as interested in the money as she was in the sex, Dan? I do, really. I think it was kind of currency for her. It was something she could offer that would either get her, she thought, companionship, friendship, or buying beer, which was her other way to get the companionship and friendship. I don't know how much of it, especially, at age 11, 12, 13, was for the for sex sake. I don't know how much of it was her actual sexual appetite. I honestly don't know. But I know that, she was desperate to be accepted. And as you know, peer pressure, etc. She was particularly vulnerable, I think, to that kind of thing happening. And because she'd had some exposure to it in another environment, which, as I've admitted to you, I simply do not know. I mean, at different times she cited a neighborhood man, an Elvis lookalike, a truck driver who stopped over, her grandfather, one of the neighborhood boys, and then she would go back and, she named her rapist as all these different people and kept changing her story. So I can't tell you who did it, but we know somebody did. So by then, she'd lost her virginity, and I think it was a way to engage with people in a way. To me, that was the feeling I was left with, that as much as sex drive, it had as much to do with this wish for money, which carried on through the rest of her life because she saw it as a way of buying friends, as you mentioned, that very poignant, she threw a party and then she was booted out of it herself. But she saw money as a way to try to improve her life, I think, if that makes sense.
Well, what I mean, I think I misspoke with the promiscuity. It really
Okay.
It was something, like you say, that she had to offer. She really didn't have much to offer. She was desperate to have a friend, to have a confidant, to have family and family and friends. And so,
then, actually.
Yeah.
She was desperate to have a boyfriend. I mean, Mark Farron, one of the men I interviewed, you know, she was very, very keen to have him as her boyfriend, you know, that kind of thing. And, of course, she never did have him as her boyfriend and never did have any of those other boys as her boyfriend. And other local girls had boyfriends. So she was left out of that as well. If you look at it, I sort of liken it to a stack of dominoes. You know, you line them up and eventually there's so many of them that they just start tipping. And all these strikes against her. You know, she had a hearing problem, and that was never really addressed. Her grandmother didn't take her to the doctor, and I don't know how much she struggled in school, but there's every reason to think she did. A teacher wrote in one school report, "This child needs help now." That was ignored, but someone noticed that something was wrong. You know, there were just all these sort of opportunities that were missed, I suppose, and in a very dysfunctional family. And then, of course, when her brother Keith died of cancer at age 21, that was a terrible blow to her. Her grandmother died, alcoholism, we think, but certainly she was, you know, a sort of closet alcoholic. It turned out, you know, certainly drinking heavily, but I think many around her have used the term alcoholic. And then the grandfather, you know, who took his own life ultimately. So, you know, there's suicide around her, there's alcoholism, there's just nothing that is sort of life-affirming, really.
Let's take it back just a little bit to, I think, again, another really crucial time in her life. Not that all of these events don't have this definite negative impact, but as we mentioned in the introduction, that she had a child that I think 15 years of age. Tell us what, you know, some back in the good old days, people didn't react so well, and maybe they don't react so well today. But what was their, you know, Lori, and what was the grandparents' reaction to her being pregnant?
Well,
tell us about that.
He was furious, Dan. He was absolutely livid. She hid it quite well for quite a long time. Her sister recognized it first, and then, you know, there was a confession to the grandmother. But Lowry was absolutely furious, and she was packed off to an unwed mother's home, and she gave birth to the baby. And as per the grandfather's instructions, I understand that she was never allowed to hold the baby. It was taken away immediately. He was taken away. It was a boy. And put out for adoption. And somewhere he's out there, you know, probably completely unaware that his mother was Aileen Wuornos. You know, his birth mother is Aileen Wuornos, because all those records are sealed. But Aileen then went home again, and everything escalated with the grandfather, and he threw her out, and, you know, pretty soon afterwards she was living in the woods, and that was the period in her life when her friend Dawn Botkins, who came back into her life during the death row years, was a good friend to her, and her only real close friend, I think. So, but yeah, she would sleep in cars in people's driveways, in trailers in campers in people's driveways with permission, you know, or in the woods. And God, if you've been to Michigan in the winter, well, you're Canadian, you should know.
Yeah.
You know, we're talking about some pretty miserable freezing conditions there. I don't know how she got through it all, and certain people did try to help her, but you know, what a life, really. Yeah. So some of the some of the people that she was, according to Dawn Botkins, what were the kind of people and the kind of things that she was gravitating towards at that time when she was still young, still a teenager, living in the woods, living from her wits, basically from the
the goodness of some people or giving her a shower or getting her, understanding her situation and feeling sorry for her. What did she move towards in this time?
Well, I think, she was then irretrievably on the path to a life of prostitution. She didn't have the schooling, she didn't have the qualifications, she didn't have the grooming, she didn't have the social skills because of her other anger issues, etc., to really enter the workforce. She didn't really have much of a chance, did she? So prostitution, maybe she could have got a job in a McDonald's or a Pizza Hut or something, where she didn't need to be able to, have a college degree or any of the other kind of loftier qualifications. She could have perhaps got that kind of job, but I personally feel she wouldn't have lasted very long because I can't see her dealing with the customers, I think she'd have been throwing something at somebody pretty quickly. So what do we go back to? What she started out with. She could always make a buck with the prostitution. It came at a high price. I'm sure she was raped multiple times. I don't, as you know, believe it was by those men on those days when she robbed them and set out to rob them and ultimately murdered them. But I do believe she was raped multiple times, as many prostitutes are. And I think when she was young, this was probably a pretty productive financially for her. But by the time we get to the year of the murders, she was, mid-30s, and that's getting older for a prostitute, I think. And,
yes.
She'd led a hard life, and it showed, and it was getting harder for her. But in those early days, I think that's probably what she fell back on. I don't know what else she could have done, really. There was some talk of her going for a job interview or two. I tried to follow up with a company where she supposedly interviewed for a job, but they didn't have any records. It was too long ago, etc. I never actually came up with any job she'd actually ever held, other than, the prostitution and interviewing men who she'd been with, etc. So as far as I know, that was pretty much it. Now, Dawn always has said, I didn't interview Dawn personally, but Dawn always has said that she didn't know Aileen was a prostitute when she was in school and was turning up with this money. She just knew she would disappear for a while and come back with money, and then they'd go buy beer or whatever. So she was secretive about it too, But so there was probably some shame around it, I'm sure.
Now, she is this, again, we'll have to categorize this characterize this the way it really is. She's a very small-time prostitute. She's not what you might classify as a sex trade worker or an escort. And some of this is also characterized by other things that she racks up this, it's petty crime, but a list of crimes over the years. We're talking about a young woman going into prostitution, and then when the trouble hits, or when the murders start, she's in her mid-30s, like you say. So in this time, she acquires this record, but it's categorized by her using aliases. So tell us a little bit about some of the things that she encounters police with, and tell us a little bit about these aliases that she uses.
Yes, well, she stole her sister's ID. She stole an ID from someone called Susan Blahovic, and she stole an ID from Tyra's friend Cammie Green, with whom they stayed when the two women first met. She took her ID, and she would use their names, all over the place. And this, of course, confused the issue for everybody initially. She would stay with people and she would steal from them. She stayed with Christian and church people several times. They gave her a place to stay, and after she'd gone, things would be missing. She'd taken them. But her encounters with the law tended to be, other than a bit of sort of shoplifting as a teenager were pretty minor, often traffic-related, having a fight on a bus with a driver, this kind of thing. The biggest incident, and the one that put her behind bars for 3.5 years, was when she and her then boyfriend had a fight, and she thought they were going to break up, and she got up in the morning and she took a gun and she went off in her bikini in a bone shaker car, and she bought a bunch of beer and got very drunk, and she went in and held up a little mini-mart. So armed robbery, that's a serious crime.
Yeah.
And the woman behind the counter was scared to death, and you can't blame her, because somebody drunk waving a gun at you is, scary in many ways, let's face it. So that was her big offence, and that was where she got her real record. There was an incident somewhere along the way where she shot herself in the stomach, a suicide attempt of some kind. But she wasn't a big-time criminal or anything, but she had a capacity for being full of righteous indignation. If the police stopped her for something, and she would give them false ID and everything else, but she'd be livid with them for having the gall to question her, etc. So she, it was very interesting in a way that she didn't have a feeling of, oh my God, I've got somebody else's ID, they're going to catch me. No, there was none of that. It was, I'm going to, get them fired from their jobs, and quite a bit of grandiosity, if you will, about her powers and potential impact on events that, of course, was completely out of line with reality. So
now she has a marriage, so tell us a little bit about this short-lived marriage.
Yeah, well, the short-lived marriage, and it was very short-lived, was to a way older man. Gosh, I'm trying to remember now. Was he 67 or 76? I can't remember. But it was 67. Keith had died, and she was at a very vulnerable point, and he had some money, that's for sure, and they did some nice outings and things, but it went sour rapidly. And her sister Laurie has said since that she is ashamed to say that when she was interviewed by the police and they said, Aileen said that Louis Fell, her husband, beat her with a cane, but Louis Fell said that Aileen beat him with a cane. Laurie had said, that Aileen was telling the truth, but years later she admitted that, she's ashamed to say that she lied. She was just too embarrassed to admit that her sister had beaten an elderly man with a cane, but in fact it was Aileen who beat Louis Fell with a cane. And we're talking a few months here. That was it. They were apart, and it was just an odd, short-lived event, probably not terribly meaningful in the overall scheme of things.
Now, what I thought was important, too, is when you talked about when she thought that her boyfriend was going to leave or that they were going to break up, it almost was like a violent trigger. She's already certainly a violent, prone to violent person anyway, but I think this will be important as we explain things later on in events with Tyra as well.
Right, Yes.
Just the idea that if there's a threat of someone leaving, that was very, again, the fear of abandonment was a strong issue with Aileen Wuornos.
Well, both prosecution and defense psychologists, psychiatric experts agreed that she had a borderline personality disorder. She was not mentally ill, but she had a personality disorder, and they're notoriously difficult to correct. And borderline's biggest issue is fear of abandonment. And yes, so when that boyfriend, who I did interview, by the way, he was a nice guy, he was very fun, and he actually went and visited her in prison for quite a time. You know, he was a good guy in many ways. But yes, the thought of losing him, and this is why I've always debated the fact that, you know, she was a lesbian, Dan, and I think we talked about this before, because I met quite a number of men she'd had sex with of her own volition, with no money involved, and she liked being involved with men. I think that later, the two women she got involved with, it was an emotional bond as much as a sexual bond. I think she did like sex with men, and I don't even know that I'd call her a man-hater myself. I've always said she sort of was an equal opportunity hater. She and others in the other characters would agree with that she hated the world. She thought the world was out to get her, and she hated everybody at times, just those few trusted people. So yes, when she thought he was going to dump her, she freaked out, and of course ultimately destructed the relationship. Destructed? That doesn't sound right. Destroyed the relationship herself by ending up in prison, you know. So that drove the wedge between them. I don't know if they would have broken up or not, but she was difficult to be with, that man told me. Very difficult to be with, very volatile, mercurial, mood swings, drama, etc. So I don't know how long it would have lasted, but he was quite loyal to her in many ways, and he did go visit her. And she looked forward to his visits. But meanwhile, she was writing letters to men through the personals, and she'd lined up a couple of pen pal guys, that one of whom she went to when she was released from prison and stayed with for a while in another state. So she was an interesting character in many ways.
So now tell us about the fateful meeting of Tyra Moore, and tell us a little bit, before we get to that meeting, I guess, who is Tyra Moore? Tell us a little bit about the background of her.
Right. Well, Tyra Moore, she was a maid, I guess that would be the term, at a rather nice hotel in Daytona Beach area, and you know, she did the laundry, she looked after the rooms, she went to work, she held down a job, she liked to party, she liked to drink, she was a fun-loving gal, and she is fun, you know, she's a outgoing personality. She'd had an accident of some sort, knocked her teeth out, and she got some insurance money for this, and she had the choice between having her teeth fixed or getting a ticket and moving to Florida, and she'd chosen to move from her home in Ohio to Florida, and she never did get those teeth fixed. So, but she had a very good friend in Cammie Green. She had another very good friend in Sandy Russell, who are featured quite prominently in the book, because they spent quite a lot of time around her, and certainly around Tyria. And Tyria, you know, was a loyal friend. She loved the children. She loved Cammie's children. They were happy having her live with them, etc. So she seemed quite sort of stable person until Aileen came into her life. But she certainly did like to drink, and there was that side of her too. So when the two of them got together, it was a recipe for, well, it didn't enhance Tyria's career, let's put it that way, you know. But she was a feisty gal, and there was no question that she was as strong as Aileen, and that they used to wrestle, apparently, and, you know, each gave as good as they got. And Tyra had a fight with one of the managers at the hotel one time, but basically was looked back on as a good worker by people and a nice young woman. So that was the backdrop to Tyra, and a family of siblings up in Ohio who seemed quite close, as best I could tell.
So when she met Aileen, basically Aileen told her what about her career, or What'd she tell her about herself?
Yeah, she told her that she was involved in a carpet cleaning, steam cleaning business, and she would go off apparently to work, purportedly to this job, to work with this service, this carpet cleaning service, and then she would go out on the highways. But it became evident very quickly that something else was afoot, and Tyra was no fool. I mean, she knew, but there was this little bit of what should we say, a little bit of role playing early on, where that was how she presented herself, as someone with a job, and she did have a relationship. Her only other relationship that I know of with another woman preceded Tyria, and it was somebody who did have such a business. I don't believe she was involved in it. I don't believe at that time she was doing anything with that business. Maybe it was a story that felt natural to her because she had lived with someone working in that field. But, so Tyria, she didn't want her hooking. She didn't want her going out, and being in danger. But at the same time, she liked the spoils of her going out and coming back with the money. So it was one of those situations where somebody had to keep bringing the money in, and Tyra, she did have this job, then she lost that job. They moved around a lot, Dan. They stayed in mobile homes. They lived a bit in the woods briefly themselves. They had, a room in a house. Motel rooms. They stayed with one of Tyria's co-workers briefly for a while, who couldn't wait to get rid of them, and said, you're not coming back if you bring her with you, meaning Aileen, because there was so much sort of fighting and screaming and shouting, and she just couldn't take it. So I think her life got steadily more chaotic, let's put it that way, and the drinking, they would drink a case of beer together in an evening, so that's not really conducive to holding down a job either. But Tyria did have jobs for periods of time. She did, but they were both. They liked to drink and they liked to go to bars and they liked to shoot guns in the woods and really pretty much do what they wanted.
Right.
Not disciplined life in any fashion.
So at some point, Aileen is basically the sole supporter, and when they do get their money, like you say, it's like a windfall, and so they go and they party, they drink a lot of beer, so a lot of money is going towards that.
Yes.
And each place that they get to stay, which are mostly friends of Tyria, they really do want to get rid of Aileen because of her odd, disrespectful, violent behavior. So
yes, that's fair to say.
Even though, like you depict in the book, and like you have mentioned through this whole interview, there really wasn't this, again, in some people's mind, this stereotypical man and woman in this relationship. They were very much very similar in a lot of ways. These two people, Tyria and certainly one wasn't a submissive personality. But in terms of Aileen, she saw this as, at least in one aspect, that she wanted to be a supporter of her woman, her significant partner, and provide for her, didn't she?
She did, and how much of it was that, and how much of it, again, was the fear of abandonment if she didn't come through with rent money or motel bill money or something. I don't know, but yeah, no, she definitely took on that role at various times, and I think that she knew that if she had no money, Tyra was not going to stick around. I mean, I don't think that she would have stuck around if they'd had to live in the woods for any length of time, for example. Even though there was a sort of laziness to the lifestyle and, very laid back compared to anyone who's ever held down a 9-to-5 job and very unstructured lifestyle, I don't think that Tyria would have stuck around for that. I think the money was a critical element, and for Aileen, yes, she did want to look after her, I think, but she also did not want to lose her. Personally, I think not wanting to lose her was probably as strong as wanting to look after her, or maybe they were just inextricably woven together.
Now, there are some, I hate to skip along, but there are some incidents with Tyria's friends that are very, very crucial to later on, where Aileen, in her sort of crazy state, says some really, again, statements that will haunt her later. Please describe one of these events where she's talking about the Bonnie and Clyde idea that she's going to be famous and this person want to be involved.
When they were staying with Cammy Green, Cammy told me that one afternoon Aileen said, come join us. Do you want in on this? We're going to be like Bonnie and Clyde. We're going to do something that no woman's ever done before. We're going to make a lot of money. And Cammy said, is it legal? What is it? What is this plan? And she was very wary, because she was wary of Aileen, period. And yes, she did have this desire for fame. She had a desire for some kind of gangster status, if you will. Maybe gangster's not the right word, but Bonnie and Clyde, yes. And there's also that incident where she approached a guy. She wanted a book written about her, but this is prior to the murders, and told him, I'm going to tell you some stuff that nobody knows about. And so I always say the murders we know of, because we really don't know that Richard Mallory was her first victim. She may have seen something and not participated in it in another era in her life when she was hanging out with some bikers or whatever. I don't know. But she definitely wanted fame, celebrity, and she knew the name of a couple of crime writers, and she wanted them to write about her. All of this pre the murders. So, what they were going to write, I'm not exactly sure. But her plan was always to be a hero to women, a Bonnie and Clyde type, hero, in the way that such characters become sort of heroic in a funny way,
in a Hollywood way.
Yeah, in a Hollywood way. In a, I'm losing the word, but not fantastic, but not fairy tale. That's not the word, but in a. Yeah, exactly. And those characters appealed to her, and Bonnie and Clyde was something that came up time and again, that she had these visions of ending up like Bonnie and Clyde. Now, of course, we know what happened to Bonnie and Clyde, and I have a feeling that was not what she, had in mind for her future. But the fame of them, the celebrity of them,
notoriety
to her. The notoriety, exactly. Yeah.
Now, there's a point when Aileen starts, comes back to the motel with a vehicle, and
yes.
And so the big question for a lot of people, and we won't get into this right at this moment, but with Tyria is how much did she know? We talked about how much did she know initially about what Aileen did, and when she brings a car back, she gives some excuse like, and Tyria knew that she didn't have friends that would just give her a vehicle to use, rent, or otherwise. And there were other things that were there as well that Aileen sold or used, or at least that Tyria was aware of.
And gave to Tyria, unlike, the movies have portrayed the Tyria character as sort of this innocent. Yes, she had the dead men's possessions, some of them. Some were pawned, some were put in a little warehouse, a storage unit that they rented. But yes, she knew. I mean, when the police picked Tyria up, she had several items that belonged to victims in her possession. But that first time she came home, she said to Ty, "I killed a man today." And Ty was sort of disbelieving at first, but she did see the car outside, and she did see the goods that came in the house. And years later, or at least after the trial, she did admit to me, Tyria, that I said, "Well, what were you thinking? What was going through your mind?" And she said, and it was really kind of stunning in a way to me, she said, "Well, I knew she was angry, and I knew she was angry at men, and I thought she'd got it out of her system. She did ultimately believe that she'd killed this man, and of course, obviously she had killed a man that night, but she thought she'd got it out of her system. And she, I think, felt some regret, as she should have done, that when the cars kept coming and news stories accelerated, and in one case they had a car for over a month, she could have perhaps saved some lives if she'd opened her eyes a bit more and actually taken action. But she didn't. And, when we got to the end of the killing spree, right before the arrests, Tyria went up to her family in Ohio for Thanksgiving. And there was always this business of, I couldn't leave Aileen because I was afraid of her. But in reality, she didn't have to come back after Thanksgiving. Right. And she came back and there was another murder. So I don't buy that personally, that she was so afraid. That would have been her perfect opportunity to make the break, wouldn't it?
Certainly, and I don't think the police believe that story either, but of course that's why they forced her to wear a wire. So we're jumping ahead a little bit. Now, with let's start with Richard Mallory, because you describe it in great detail, and later she, again, has a defense in court that later we find out through your great book that there's a confession, and it's very, very comforting to the families, because it is a heinous allegation to deal with, along with that their loved one was killed. So tell us about Richard Mallory and what was maybe the first murder.
Yeah. Well, Richard Mallory, he liked prostitutes, he liked sex, he liked porn, he liked, nightclubs. He was heading up to Daytona, I think, for the weekend, and he'd already had a couple of women earlier that night at one of his haunts. And he started driving, and he gave her a ride, and it was late, and they bought some booze, and they pulled into the woods, and according to Aileen, they sat talking for like 5 hours, drinking and talking. And then, this is where it gets murky, because Aileen, initially, when she was arrested, said that she shot him because she thought he was going to rape her. She thought he wasn't going to pay her. He had given her the money, but she thought he would take it back. Variations on that theme, nothing at all like the story she came out with at her trial a year later, where he'd brutalized her, tied her to the steering wheel, she'd fought him off, killed him in an attempt to save her own life during a violent rape. Nothing like that. Now, here, Dan, we have to look at the facts and we have to look at the evidence. Richard Mallory was fully clothed. He was in the driver's seat. The first bullet entered his, I'm trying to think which side now, because I'm from England and we drive on the different side, and I'm not sure which side you drive on. But, okay, she was in the passenger seat leaning across that chair seat, and the first bullet went into his arm and through on into his chest. He jumped out of the car and tried to escape, obviously, and she ran around the front of the car and fired 3 more bullets into him. And it was, according to the medical examiner, a slow, agonizing death. So, we're dealing with a man here who is fully clothed and behind the wheel in his own car. when he was killed, which is not the same as in the middle of her being, her being tied to the steering wheel and him anally raping her and things that she later claimed at the trial. She also claimed, she was bloodied and beaten and battered, but Tyra said there was not a mark on her that night, nor did she complain about having been attacked. So then we look at what she did next. If it was the first time she'd killed somebody, or even if it wasn't, she, you'd think she'd be so freaked out she would run. But no, not only did she try to cover the body with bits of old carpet and twigs, but she turned inside out his pockets and she took his money. And then she made off with his car and his goods, and she buried some of his possessions in one spot, some in another, and, made a real attempt to cover up the evidence, as it were. So there's a big chasm here, really, between what has been popularized as what Aileen did and what, has been put in movie. The facts don't bear that out. That's not how the bullets went in. That's not the scenario, And if you've just been brutalized in such a fashion, I don't think you're going to lean down and, this dying man, turn his pockets inside out and take his money and everything. You're just going to hightail it out of there, I would have thought, But It was just such a vastly different account. So this is where it gets a bit tricky because, yes, the two of them were going to have sex. That was the original intention. But he enjoyed talking to her, and he said, you should be a psychologist, a counselor, you're really a good listener, you're good at this. They had a nice time together, hanging out for hours. And then suddenly... Now, I've since talked for the new edition of Lethal Intent, I've since talked to a forensic psychiatrist and others who said, what she thought was happening may have had nothing to do with what was actually happening between her and this man. It may have been something completely inside her own head, more like a PTSD type experience. But in any event, there was no brutal rape with that man that day. Yes, there was sex with the two victims who were found nude, no question. But there were other victims who were not found nude, and who I do believe there was a good chance gave her a lift. She was in shorts and a T-shirt, hitchhiking on the freeway. She had a photograph of a family, children, that she would show them and say, look, these are my kids. They're in a motel. They're waiting for me to come back. They're hungry. Can you give me a ride? Now, there are men who would say yes to that. And the thing is that we have 7 dead men, 6 actually, because Peter Seams has never been found to this day, his body. She can't remember where she left it. But, where not only are they murder victims, but they are also labeled as rapists. And this was tremendously painful for the families, as you can imagine. So, and with no evidence, by the way, to support that. I mean, we're talking about a woman who travelled with a bottle of Windex with her gun in her kill bag, and who said a killing day is much like any other day. And she cleaned down fingerprints. She was very methodical about it. She wanted to know how the police caught her. She thought she'd been very careful. So, to see these families have the double whammy of having their loved ones murdered without evidence. I'm not saying that none of them raped her. I can't know, Dan, but I do know we can't prove it, and we don't know for sure. And there was no evidence of that. And some of them were shot in the back of the head. There was just nothing really that supported any of that. So when she finally turned around before her execution, in that last year or two, and said there was no self-defense, I didn't kill in self-defense, the families did take some comfort in that, at least those who were still alive. As you can imagine, there was some comfort in that. It was a little too late, but not too late. It gave some comfort.
How much of an important issue, and when did this actually come up? Because I don't remember it from the first edition, was that Richard Mallory, ironic twist, had a criminal record, and I hate to bring up anything, cast dispersions on this man that's deceased, but how important was this to the defense in that he did have a criminal record for break and enter and attempt to rape, or with intent to rape, when he was younger?
You actually said it correctly, Dan, which mostly, almost overwhelmingly, it's not reported that way. He didn't rape anyone. It was an attempted rape. That is not to say that he wasn't intent upon raping someone. He was. He'd been watching this woman as he made his deliveries. She would be lying on the couch, and he could see her through the window. And one day, he went into the house, and he went up to the bathroom, and she was in the shower, and she screamed, and I think he screamed too, and ran out. So that was the encounter, and he was sent to an institution. He was just shy of going into the army. He was 19 years old, and he was institutionalized rather than incarcerated, I think you would say, for 4 years or so. And, of course, okay, so he's 19, so say mid-20s. So by the time we get to the murders, we've got 25 years of no incidents, no records, no arrests, no nothing. So as far as the judge was concerned, it was all just too distant in time. Yes, it was an ironic twist, but I did talk to hookers who were with Richard Mallory, who knew Richard Mallory, and who said he'd never been violent. He had some problems. He was about to go into the army, and, you know, maybe he had some kind of sexual addiction thing going on. I don't know. He was an acne-ridden youth at the time, and it's hard to know. But, yes, he did indeed break into this woman's home. I don't know if the door was locked, but let's say that it was. He broke in, and he did go upstairs, and his intent was to have sex with her. So there's no denying that. But the only thing you can say is that, well, what can you say, Dan? I don't know really, but that's, I mean, I did get the records and of the time he served and where he served it, and there was one incident while he was in there where I think he raised his hand to one of the prison guards, a female, something that got him a bit of extra time. But anyway, legally speaking, it was just too distant in time to be considered as a mitigating factor. You know, that the defense, you know, could use to say anything. I'm sorry. As Dan knows, I'm suffering a bit under a cold here, so I'm trying to think clearly. I'm doing my best.
No, and the thing is, why I just made that point was how much defense could use that to their advantage. Right. Even though, again, the judge had the good sense to say, and even I would say, okay, that it makes no sense given the evidence of absolutely no self-defense and no evidence of any attempted rape or rape with Aileen, and given her confession and given her confession, and so really we have to say that, you know, I didn't bring it up to cloud the issue at all. It's just was an ironic twist, and the defense could use it.
It's a fair question. He's not like all the other men. You know, he was he did go to the topless bars, and he did go hang out in that side of town. I mean, that was his lifestyle. But I didn't find any other evidence of any violence against women, or, you know, hear any complaints of violence against women, or find any complaints of violence against women. Now, what happened was that some of this was known about the fact that he had something in his past, but because back then, between the states, it was not all computerized and interconnected as things are much more today. The defense didn't have the full file, I don't believe, at the time of the trial, and that was why Dateline was able to come out later and say, guess what, this guy had, you know, this in his past. Something was known. I guess he told his girlfriend Jackie, who took the stand at one point, and she, I can't remember now if it was in front of the jury or not, but it did come up that he had something in his background, but the full details of it emerged after the trial.
Right. So now we have some time, if you can still accommodate our audience, because we're nowhere near getting to some of the story. We won't go through all of it. We got to leave something for the people to enjoy in the reading. But there are so many. There is such a cast of characters once the trial occurs, and then afterwards we've got defense lawyers. We've got born-again Christians adopting Aileen Wuornos, Arlene Prell. We have an actress who wants to make a movie and ends up involved. So it was a real super media circus. So tell us a little bit about the trial and the media and the world's attention on this, what they really deemed her the America's first serial killer. Tell us about the media circus.
Well, her trial was actually in a small courtroom in DeLand, Florida, and I was there every day. And there were local news people, and there were visiting producers from Dateline, etc., who would, come in for a day or two. Documentarian would come in for a day or two. But really the reporters were Florida people, and I know because I sat with them every day, and it wasn't as much of a media circus in that little town as you would have imagined somehow. It really, or maybe as I've seen in other cases, let's put it that way. I mean, it was a big case, but I think the whole thing of first female serial killer, I mean, yes, there have been women who've killed multiple times. I think the whole label thing, really sprang from the fact that she killed in male fashion, i.e. killing strangers in different locations with a cooling off period in between, which at the time was part of the FBI's definition of a serial killer. And women, as you know, don't tend to kill that way. They tend to kill people in their care. They tend to kill husbands for insurance money, to poison them. And there's all kinds of other ways that they kill. But to kill 3 people, on different occasions, in different locations, it was kind of a shock at the time, and that was really why the case sort of captured the imagination of so many, and including myself, I must add, because that was why I was so fascinated to learn what made Aileen tick, and that was why I decided to cover the trial and write a book. And that was 1991.
1991. And so of course, the death penalty in Florida is a little quicker, but tell us about the fight for the state to execute her and Aileen's fight to be executed.
Yes. Well, they went through all the regular appeals, but Aileen had said very early on that she wanted her execution carried out. She was shocked to be convicted. She didn't enter a plea. She pled no contest to murders 2, 3, 4, and by then she'd kind of given up. She wasn't fighting it. She wanted to be executed, and she kept that thread going through very much through the 10 years. However, when all the appeals, the appeals that are automatic, of course, whether she wanted them or not, took place, and then when it came time where she'd run out of those options, it became an issue of, do you really want it carried out, Aileen? Because it's one thing to say it, but you have to waive your rights to further appeals at a certain point. You can't kind of keep changing your mind. And so she did ask for some extra time. She wanted to think about it further. And but then she came back, and yes, she'd made up her mind. She wanted to go be with God, and that was her decision. Now, volunteers for execution are very rare. I've forgotten the number of volunteers in the last 20 years in the US, but very small number. And I talked to someone who'd done a study of people who volunteer, and one common thread with them was often a Christian person in their lives or an influence in their lives where they had in their minds, through their own belief or beliefs that became sort of instilled over time through other people influencing them, that they were going to go be with God. Now, for Aileen, she had to tell the truth and had to get right with God before she could take that step. That was, in her mind, necessary to get into heaven, which, of course, is where she wanted to be. So, there are those volunteers, and then there are some who volunteer because they are suicidal. And there are some who say that they are mentally ill, and some who say they're not mentally ill, and basically try to game the system, as it were. If they've made up their minds they want to have their execution carried out, they've got to fight against all the Bianca Jaggers of this world and the anti-death penalty protesters who come out in force. And Aileen was very annoyed when those people rose up and said, you can't execute this woman, she's mentally ill. She was furious. She wasn't mentally ill. She never thought of herself as mentally ill. You could guarantee to anger her if you called her mentally ill or mad or crazy. Those words would drive her crazy, So she didn't want them interfering. She didn't want the lawyer that the court appointed to her during that phase, and she continued having problems with the jail. They appointed a lawyer to represent her in her claims that her food was being tampered with, etc., etc. But again, as one of the experts pointed out to me, if you talk to a banker and he says someone spat in his food in the canteen, you have to sort of think, okay, is this guy paranoid or is he sane, etc. But when it's in prison, people do spit in food, and they do much worse, as he said. So it's not a sign of any insanity to make such claims. So she did make those claims, and so there was a separate issue going on with her complaints about various warders who she felt had it in for her and that they were going to rape her before she was executed and other things. She also believed, as did Dawn, who was her close confidant during those years before the execution, that the police had not arrested her as early as they could, that they knew who she was long before, but they didn't arrest her because they wanted to wait, because the more people she killed, the more money they would get from selling their story, which of course is ludicrous because, Dan, if you know anything about the way the police operate, as you do and I do, we're talking, I think, 5 counties here, to have a conspiracy between the police in 5 counties that they were going to not arrest a known serial killer. I mean, all of the cops wanted to find her, wanted to arrest her. So it's a ludicrous claim, but she did, that was one of her ongoing issues, was she killed as many people as she did because they didn't want to stop her, because it would have made more money for them, made a better movie, made a better whatever, So she did have some distorted thinking. There's no question about it. Insane, no, but distorted thinking, yes, sure. For sure. Yeah.
Yeah, she has quite a few traits of the psychopathic personality pathology as well, and in terms of, we know that those symptoms are, or characteristics are. How much was Aileen Carol an influence in having Aileen come to God and make this very, very important confession, which was very important for the sake of what was the truth in this story, but also, like you said, you mentioned in the book, and this is a very strong reaction I had when the families got that little semblance of, not closure, but little semblance of peace in that she had confessed and said it was not self-defense and that their loved ones were not rapists.
Right. And as I, put in the book, she killed, and you mentioned, she killed 3 men in as many weeks at one point when she thought Ty was going to leave her because her sister was visiting. And, there's no doubt in my mind that this was the precipitating factor when she would decide, okay, I've got to go off and I need the money. And I'm not going to, she said herself, I wasn't going to leave any witnesses, So she wanted the money. She identified the fact they'd got money and she killed them. And that was, she was a robber who killed. So, what was the question?
Well, I was talking about the role of Aileen Carol in that she was a born-again Christian, had adopted her.
Yes.
And that was, I thought that she was a very, very important figure in the the end outcome of what happened in terms of those confessions. And I thought that we passed over this aspect that the police had forced. Well, Tyria didn't have much of a choice, but she was wired and basically got confessions from Aileen, and Aileen knew that she was being recorded, and so tell us. I mean, not to say there's too many redeeming aspects of Aileen Wuornos, but what does she do? What does she attempt to do for Tyria?
Well, Tyria says, I'm not going down for crimes that you committed and that I had nothing to do with. And Aileen said, I'm not going to let that happen to you, which is why she was such a fascinating character. She did confess to get Tyria off the hook, to make it plain that only one person had committed these crimes. And the police knew this in at least several instances because Tyria had alibis, she was working, I think, with one. She was out of state in another. Whatever. She had alibis for several, and they really didn't think she was along on the murders. But certainly they were able to use that to their advantage. And just to address the Christian thing, Aileen had always had this streak in her. She'd, of reading the Bible. I think I mentioned she stayed with some Christian people a couple of times, and one place they put a roof over her head and then she walked out and took belongings from them, etc. But she came to religion back and forth. So I think Aileen probably was a catalyst, and it was what Aileen needed at that time, but she didn't take her from being, an atheist to a Christian, for example. There was always that side to Aileen that was interested in religion and God and believed, I think. So, but of course, Aileen really strengthened that. And one of the messages she hammered home was you have to tell the truth. You have to confess to what you actually did and get right with God, and then, He'll be ready for you and you'll go where you want to go.
What I thought was very interesting, too, and I just read this in your updated version, and those lucky enough to get this new version will read this little gem as well, is that it's not well known at all. Of course, probably only in your book is this revealed, that Tyria and Aileen were in contact after the death penalty, while she was incarcerated, and even that Aileen had given her $1,000. And I thought,
yes, that was pretty interesting, wasn't it? See, I've always said that money was important to Aileen, and there's another example of it. And when the television shows paid $10,000 or whatever, she would say who's going to get how much money. There was a little bit of a power trip that went with that, She allocated, and more money went to Dawn Botkins, say, than to Aileen Carol, who had traveled back and forth, who'd taken I know, having taken collect calls from death row, that they're darned expensive, and they can only call collect. You know, she'd spent a lot of money, and she got $2,500 out of one payment, and I think Dawn was supposed to get $4 or whatever. But yes, that was interesting to find out, and the fact that the filmmaker Jacqueline Giroux told me that she had set up this P.O. box for them to write to one another. I was pretty surprised, I have to say. You know, that took me aback. Yeah, and that was when I was writing the update, just, you know, the end of last year. So, yes, what a turn up for the books, eh? I would like to know what else was said between them. And it's very interesting that Aileen would send her money, but that came out of a letter between Aileen and Dawn, I think, if I remember correctly. That bit of information about the 1,000, yeah. Mm-hmm.
What we'll leave for the readers of Lethal Intent will be the conversation. Some of the Donna, her childhood friend Donna, is the person that
Watkins.
Dawn, pardon me. Yeah. Yes, Dawn. Yes. She is the person that was with Aileen the evening before her execution.
That's correct.
All the people to be with her, and so we'll leave it for the reader to discover what you have found speaking with Dawn about that evening and what transpired.
Well, I did not speak to Dawn, but she talked to the press after the execution. Yeah, but I did speak to Troy Burris's sister right the day before the execution, and after she witnessed it, she came out and we spoke on the phone that afternoon. So, you know, I had an inside story from that point of view, but I didn't speak to Dawn. Just have to set the record straight on that.
Right.
Yes. Yes,
yeah,
I hope the reader enjoys it. Enjoys finding out about this.
Well, it's just amazing, again, the twists and turns in this. I know that's a cliche, the twists and turns, but, I mean, this is a story that just kept growing and growing, and just an amazing, again, depiction of this person, this very, very complicated person, and then you end up in the end almost feeling sorry for her to a certain degree, and yet, like many people, they say, yes, well, you know, we felt for her. She certainly was an abused person, certainly had a rough life. However, she really did deserve what she got, you know.
She was a victim, but she was a victimizer. And it was very emotionally draining and confusing writing the book, I have to say, you know, because of the mixed emotions that came up with obviously tremendous empathy for everything she went through as a kid. It was heartbreaking, all of that, and heartbreaking to do the interviews and to write about it and to make the discoveries. But then, you know, it was also heartbreaking to get to know those families and to get to know what they went through and what happened to those loved ones and what kind of men some of them were, you know. So... yeah, it was an interesting journey, and you're right. You know, she did have those sociopathic traits in her, and stealing was nothing, and using somebody else's identification was nothing, and taking things from people who were good enough to give her a place to stay was nothing. And yet, when the chips were down, she stepped up and told the police so that Ty wouldn't be in trouble. I did it. I did it alone. I killed these men. And so it's, you know, it's an unusual story in that regard, isn't it? Because usually, you know, people, if they're sociopathic or worse, psychopathic, you know, they go all the way with that. But Aileen sort of had these acts that would just throw you off course just when you were thinking she was one thing. She would do something that showed a different side of her.
Well, she certainly deserves the attention that she has received all these years, the attention that she so desperately craved. In the end, she did achieve it, and like you say, she sort of enjoyed it, it seemed, and some of the people in the book would say that she probably would do it all over again for that little bit of attention that she did get and she reveled in. And again, in her misguided world, she thought at one time that she would be considered a hero for what she did. And
yes.
Again, very, very misguided person.
Yes.
But certainly she has caught the attention of people throughout the world, and this is why this story is still enduring. And of course, it helps with such a great book like Lethal Intent to really talk about and really explore. Like I said, we had just an hour really just touches on the entire story, especially because you've covered the victims' families, because it was such a it's such a heartbreaking story from their aspect and their positions, and so you had access to all that information.
And you know what we didn't talk about, Dan, which is that I just signed a contract with Audible, and
I was going to get to that.
Oh, all right. So I didn't want you to
No,
forget,
that's great news.
I'm so excited. I'm so excited about it.
Well, I'm excited to have Audible as, sponsoring the program as well because, with the advent of Publish on Demand, which, again, not that long ago was not a possibility, so people throughout the world have access to the book where certainly it wasn't shipped everywhere in the world with the conventional postal service. So that's Publish on Demand. Now, e-books, even more affordable. And if somebody is really has a spur-of-the-moment idea, well, it's available to them immediately. Now, Audible paves the way with downloadable audiobooks, and so congratulations on this book being available for everyone, even the experience. And I don't know if people have experienced audiobooks, but I have in the past, and now I just think it's great that you can get them downloadable, even more affordable, and Audible has like 150,000 titles, so it's just amazing. So congratulations on having Lethal Intent.
Yes. And I don't know when. It'll be quite a wait, I have a feeling. It's going to take someone a long time to read that book into a microphone. But I am very excited about it, yes.
Well, they really have some impressive narrators as well, so I'm very excited to, listen to the audiobook version myself because it really does bring another dimension to, you're not reading it. E-book, you're reading it. Paperback, you're reading it. But it's for those people that, I have a big fan named Louise, and she drives truck, and she listens to my programs on mobile devices and whiles away the time. And a lot of people are accessing this through their iPhones and other Androids. So it's great for those people that are tied up but really want to maximize their entertainment time and listen to a great book like Lethal Intent, so on audiobook. So
and anyone
really
with vision problems, of course, it's perfect too. And I have someone close to me who has a vision problem and couldn't read the book. So from that point of view, I'm excited about that too, that it will be available for someone. Yeah,
I think that was the first intent of the audiobook. I think initially that was one of their big markets was that, and then surprisingly a lot of people just seem to want to enjoy it, but if you start sending audiobooks via the postal service, I used to see $100, $150 box sets of audiobooks, so it becomes a little bit prohibitive when it gets that costly. What I want to say about Audible, too, is that for people that don't know, Audible is the biggest provider of radio and television programs and also audio versions of magazines and newspapers. So really they are, I didn't know that till I just looked at it myself. And, again, it's another, I think Audible is going to be able to provide people, I think, an experience that they're just not accustomed to. And I just wanted to mention, too, that they have a 30-day free trial right now, and you can get the audiobook that you desire just by signing up for that 30-day trial. So that's my big plug for Audible, and I'm glad we could work that into the conversation with Lethal Intent being finally offered as an audiobook with Audible.
Yes. So. Yes, thanks, Dan.
So, Sue, I want to thank you very much for this interview, and thanks for coming back on. You were one of the first authors that were gracious enough to come on to my little radio program, and now this radio program has got millions of listeners and diehard dedicated fans. When I put up a posting about Lethal Intent, it was all kinds of people were looking forward to it. A lot of people said they were in, just in withdrawal from not listening to the program, and so I want to thank you for ushering in the new year, the 5th year of True Murder, with coming on and talking about your great book, Lethal Intent. So thank you very much, Sue.
And congratulations to you on 5 years. That's great, Dan. Well done.
Well, it's thanks
I knew
to
you were going
great authors like yourself.
Yeah. Thanks. Well,
anyway,
I
thank you, Sue.
it. And any time. Okay, my dear. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Have a great
Bye.
evening. Thank you very much.
You too. Take care. Bye.